Hi, I'm Jason.
I'm Dre.
And I'm Leia, and this is the Post Normal Show.
Nailed it.
All right, what are we going to talk about?
So why don't you to help me imagine what your week has looked like?
Ooh, good segue. Let's see. There was a gas explosion at the bottom of my street. My daughter had her 18th birthday. I went outside and kind of freaked out because I went to buy her a lottery ticket so that she could do at least one thing that you can only do when you're 18. And I had to stand inside a store, and a man in front of me brought like 50 lottery tickets to go through the machine. Winner, gagnant, right? And he's like, I only want it in cash. And as I'm standing there, I'm thinking, I'm breathing in more and more of these possible freaking viruses. And I had to calm myself down so I didn't have a panic attack.
Yeah.
And then I got them and I left, and then I was fine.
So you almost you were in the lottery. You were in like the droplet lottery, listening to this guy.
Yeah, basically.
You didn't smoke a doob with your 18-year-old doob legal daughter now?
I don't think it's legal till you're 19.
Really? I thought it was 18.
Yeah. Yep. She can't even actually buy a lighter in a store.
You know what? I think 2020's
So
been
it's-
canceled, so she's technically still 17.
Yeah. It's very anticlimactic. It's like, yeah, you're 18, you can vote and you can buy a lottery ticket. That's about it.
I didn't know there was an age limit on buying lottery tickets.
Yeah. You can't collect money because it's gambling.
Yeah, never even thought about that.
Yeah.
Leia, how
True
about
story.
you?
I was going to say that's like the bad side of imagination, right? Like where you start to think about all the things that can go wrong.
Yeah, and you have to figure out how to recover. You have to recover from those.
But lottery is interesting because it does engage the imagination. I think a lot of people do, not realizing that the odds are absolutely atrocious. It's not a worthy investment of any dollar. You're better off just buying a dollar worth of Bitcoin. But the nice thing about the lottery is that it does engage the imagination. People imagine what it would be like to win a gajillion dollars and then transform their lives and have mansions and fast cars and that kind of stuff. So it is an interesting.
Most people just play. I think they know that they're not going to win. I think that most people are pretty sure. They hope that they're going to win, but I don't think. I think most people know that they're not going to win. You get to think about a new life, which is never as good as it sounds, because all the people that win the big money, they pretty much blow it all. They end up worse off than they were before.
Nice. Leia, what's your week been like?
Did you play the lottery?
I did not play the lottery. I've only been out once this week, and that was today to buy groceries. I did, however, find waffles. I found
nice.
pumpkin spice waffles, which are delicious. But no, I spent my week doing a bunch of presentations. I've got one more to go on Saturday on science fiction and foresight. And I guess how my week ties into imagination is hopefully I triggered other people's imagination on how to think about the future and how things are evolving.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah, I went to your the one that you had earlier in the week, which was that you did, or the re-record that you rebroadcast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was good. Thumbs up.
And how about you?
I have been staying away from the computer as much as I can. I've got some home projects. I'm painting a lot, so I've got paint all over my arm. Trying to pull it out of the arm.
You're
hairs,
painting your arm?
Yeah. And you know what? I'm painting a lot of things I shouldn't be painting.
That's a good project.
Yeah, you start by painting the walls. Next thing you know, there's paint on the floor. Yeah, it's it's a mess. I wish I could just hire professionals to do this for me, but this is the cheapest way to do it. But yeah, it's interesting. I got to experience a curbside pickup experience, to just use that word too many times. I ordered paint online a few days ago, and I finally got an email from Home Depot saying, you can come pick it up now. So you show up, and you drive your car through this gauntlet of traffic cones until somebody gets your receipt number, and then they put you in a parking spot with the big number 15 on it. And then you wait for about half an hour for somebody to come and bring you a single can
Really?
of paint. Yeah, it's interesting, but it's
Whoa.
have something to do when you do a curbside pickup, because there's maybe a dozen spots. All the spots are full of people. You just show up, you park in it, and you wait till everybody else's order's been fulfilled, and then you get your thing, which is interesting because it really got me thinking about how, when this is all said and done, that might still be a viable way to conduct business. Because going into the Home Depot and finding the stuff can be a bit of a pain in the ass. But sitting there and having somebody bring it to you, eliminates this, not decision fatigue, the overwhelm that you get from looking at shelves of things and impulse buying and so on. Which for me, the hardware store is the place to impulse buy.
That gives them an incentive not to have that service then.
You're absolutely right that my logic is flawed, but still pretty good. Still pretty good social distancing tactic for shopping. Yeah.
There's a lot of places that are trying to figure out imaginative ways to keep making some business happen while this COVID break is happening. Well, I got an email from from the place that I get my haircut, and they were asking their patrons to buy ahead, purchase your next haircut now, and
Mm-hmm.
and then you can come in sometime in the summer. They referenced the fact that we probably all look like Yetis, so it was cute, and it made me want to spend some money on them because they're good at what they do.
Yeah.
I don't normally look like this.
Yeah, I just look like this all the time. I'm a bald beard, so I can just use clippers to shave my head super easy. So I've been self-shaving for a long time now. But my favorite imaginative thing that's come to life is a thing called goat to meeting. There's a farmer
Yes.
who basically you can have a goat or a llama attend your meeting, and he puts a webcam in front of a goat in a field somewhere. And one of the
Nah.
yeah, one of the hey, you got one for our show. Thanks, Jason. So a goat or a llama just sits there and stares at a camera while you and your crew do what you're doing, chewing on their cud, if you will, which
That's
I thought was
funny.
great. And the pun killed me. Goat to meeting was maybe the
Yeah.
best pun of the week.
They're selling it as sort of a relaxing way to take a break, and they would give you a a 10-minute tour and walk you around, and you could look at the animals, and I thought that's a really smart way to let people that are cooped up to just see some nature and have a laugh, because llamas are just and goats are just inherently hilarious.
That's kind of like the corporate entertainment stuff, though, right? Like, I don't think I would get anything done in a meeting if a llama was present.
No,
Like, if I could watch the
no.
llama, I'm watching the llama.
I think it would have to be sort of a prank where you call a meeting and then you give everyone a good laugh and a break to just see some animals and hang out.
Let's be truthful. Even in a meeting full of humans, there's no focus happening. You just zoned out until it's your turn to talk.
I've had some pretty good meetings, especially the ones where the client you're presenting to demands that everyone turn on their camera.
Demands.
Yes, demands.
that could go wrong real fast.
What are you imagining?
So I came across an article this week on, do we need imagination more than ever now? given that, we on one hand are in these highly uncertain times, and it's hard to see what's ahead. And on top of that, we're kind of stuck in little boxes. Like our world has really shrunk. So, what is the role of imagination when we're going through a crisis?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
There's a way to maybe even pull that back to, um, when you look at toys and children, there's you can give a child something with basically toys that have fewer details in them, Lego, wooden blocks, a branch off of a tree, force the child to imagine more about it. Whereas, when you give people fully fleshed out, creatures, there's less of the imagination involved. You can just interact with this fully engaged thing. Going to where we are now, when you get out into the world, you don't need to imagine that much. There's a lot of stimulus, there's a lot of stuff going on. But when you're stuck at home in your apartment, the same room, the same yard, the same balcony, you need to start imagining different things to make it more interesting. One way that I do it is I imagine redecorating rooms. It's like, I'm going to spend all my time in this room. I'm going to use it up in this configuration. And then a few days, I'm going to move it all around. And then I'll enjoy the room in a different way. And I spend a lot of time imagining how I might reconfigure this room. And this is the reason why I'm painting right now, because I'm just reconfiguring everything.
That's fun. It's interesting though, because you are going to have to be more creative, because you're going to have limited, not limited time, but you're going to have some limitations, as in you're not going to be able to get or have exactly what you want. You're not going to be able to have certain kinds of professionals come in and do things for you. You're only going to be able to move certain kinds of furniture unless you take the long road and empty out every single shelf and kind of push it around on a towel or something.
Mm-hmm. Which I've been doing.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So I think for me, there's like the imagining that has to happen in the present, like doing more with what you have. And then there's the imagining that has to happen about what is going to happen next and trying to sort that whole mess out. So I think about how, the ways in which whatever comes next can be positive and negative. And I think there's something to be said about like how our imagination runs wild a little bit too. So like with you, Jason, you can imagine the droplets in the air, right? Not something you could see, but something that is potentially there. It could be there. So is
Yeah.
that like, you know, a part of our imagination now where we think there's the invisible force that we have to kind of be aware of all the time, and then thinking about how that's interacting with us? And then there's the imagining of, okay, what am I going to be? What is the world going to be? How am I going to be in the world? And all of these sort of various dynamics that are shifting now.
I
It's funny.
imagine. Go ahead, Jason.
What do you imagine? No, what do you imagine?
just, I imagine the miasma that comes out of people's mouths when I'm walking down the street. And the other day I was walking down the street, and I could imagine the potential virus cloud that was coming out of somebody's head as they were walking by. And as I was breathing, I could smell someone's perfume, and I had to like stop breathing for a block before I could continue, respiration.
I've seen all the diagrams, and it's funny, Leia, that you should say, that I was imagining the viruses in the air. I wasn't actually imagining the viruses. I wasn't actually thinking about them floating around, and I wasn't actually thinking about the person in front of me, and the sort of infographic version of it. I was actually just seeing numbers in my head go up in terms of my odds of contracting the disease, which is something that I often think in numbers and enjoy watching numbers change. But when you're thinking about the numbers being not in your favor and increasingly putting you at risk, that was what started to freak me out a little bit. I think that if I'd started getting really graphic about it, I would have had a panic attack. So the numbers thing is almost like a protectionary or protective way of keeping my brain from getting too too creative about the situation.
Question for you two, just to jump off of this COVID shit. What did you guys imagine as a child? Like, what was your like default imagination growing up as a kid? You know, playing with toys or with your friends or reading or what?
Oh, I totally lived in Fantasyland. Like
What
I
kind
did a
of
lot of reading as a kid, so I've always read like a lot of speculative stuff. So I think in reading I would escape into other worlds and that sort of thing. But I guess in another way, like I was kind of left to my own devices a lot growing up. Like,
mm-hmm.
so I did
Gen
a,
X.
well, I'm a millennial. I'm an
Oh,
early millennial.
She's a millennium.
Um, I know. So it's terrible, right? But yeah, I was kind of left alone to my own devices, which meant I wandered around, and some of the stuff that I did, was experimenting and playing, and some of it was a little bit harmful and probably wouldn't be allowed right now. Like, I tried to once cut off my eyelashes. I did succeed. With an adult pair of like heavy scissors, put them right up to my eye and just snipped. Um, no kid would be able to get away with that now. But I kind of interacted with the world, I guess, in a way where everything kind of was alive. And I guess that's an imaginative sort of child's way of looking at things, like when you think your toys are alive.
how about you, Dre? I want to hear your little Dre imagination world.
I had a lot of imagination stuff going on. I played with a lot of Star Wars toys and GI Joes and Lego and that kind of stuff. But the one thing that I remember doing a lot, and I really dug music at an early age. Like I had favorite bands a lot sooner than a lot of my friends had. So I defined tastes in music, and I always loved music. And I used to go through the Consumers Distributing Catalog, which was a department store where you would order from the catalog, and you would just show up, and they would just bring it to you from behind the counter, which is actually would be a great business model for this day and age right now.
Yeah.
And I used to go through the catalog, and I'd go to the music section, and I would, I decided I was going to be a guitar player, so I would circle the guitar, and then I would figure out which one of my friends should play drums and circle the drums. And I wanted to make a band, and I would just go into my friends' places and tell them, like, you need to ask your parents to get you this for Christmas. And if all my friends would get the instruments for Christmas in the new year, we could like start a band. It's a bunch of like 8-year-olds. So that was something that preoccupied a lot of my time, thinking about this, not realizing that my friends didn't give a shit about that at all. But I did this until like I kept on doing this until I was a teenager, because I've always loved music. I've always loved playing guitar. But I remember being one of the fundamental earliest kind of imagination memories before I could even play an instrument, was just imagine playing an instrument and doing that with friends and being in a band.
So I read a lot of fantasy when I was a kid, and I played role playing games and stuff. But when I was really little, before I think I got into all of that, I had a pretty active imagination. I thought I can remember way back some crazy things happening to me, and the way that I processed them, living out in the country, in the middle of nowhere, in a small farmhouse, sort of a hobby farm. My parents were teachers, or my dad was a teacher, and my mom was at home at the time. I would just run outside and I'd play, and there'd be nothing. Like there'd just be empty fields for miles and miles, and I could literally walk. I could probably walk. I say miles. I could probably walk X number of kilometers away and still see our house, and still easily be able to find my way home. But I would imagine like all kinds of strange things where that I would see. So when on the prairies, when you're looking down a long, long road, you get this visual distortion that happens from. I know this now. I didn't know this when I was a kid, but you get this visual distortion from the heat that's coming up off of the road, and it warps your vision. So there was one time when I thought I saw a car go off the road, quite a long, long way down, and I thought I saw these three black, really, really super skinny and super tall, like they look like they're 10 feet tall people come out, and I thought for sure they were aliens, and then they did some kind of motion with their hands, and then it looked like the car floated up out of the ditch and back onto the road. And I ran back to the house, and I told my parents, and I told all my friends that I'd seen a UFO, and I'd seen these aliens, or at least I'd seen, like most people think a UFO flies in the sky, but that I saw a UFO. They were driving a UFO, but it could float, and they were these long, skinny, black creatures, the humanoid creatures. So I was always, whatever I would see, my brain would process it in a interesting way.
That's pretty cool. Um, I like the visual effect of the heat waves, and I could totally see how, as not even as just as a kid, but as an adult, because we hear about the concept of mirages, which is like the imagined oasis in the distance, which is
Yeah.
widely attributed to heat wave air distortion, making a rock appear lanky and wavy and shimmering. So you might
Or
confuse
like it's
that
on
for a pond
fire.
of water. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool. What
And then
about
add to that the delusion of not having enough water, being dehydrated.
yeah,
And
exactly.
then
That would totally add to that
but
entire
what were you going to
experience.
ask?
Oh, I was just going to jump into the now that now that we're all grown ass adults, some more than others. What are you imagining now? Not just on a professional level, because I know that we are, you have imagination in the title of your business card, Jason. But when you're not having to imagine professionally, what do you imagine personally?
Imagine, number one, I imagine mitigating risk, which is really, really not fun to imagine. But I've got two kids. One I just got to the age of 18, so I'm pretty proud of that. So now she can take care of herself. But yeah, I've always been about mitigating risk and following rules and making sure that things are done in the right way so that the worst doesn't happen, and not in a paranoid way, but just in what I consider a practical way,
Mm-hmm.
which other people might not consider as practical because they like to have fun. Um, but if I'm not thinking about mitigating risk, I am honestly often trying to think of something in a way that other people haven't thought of, and I find that extraordinarily fun. So it could be just about anything, and I'll try to play or test out some kind of lateral thinking exercise, or try to imagine not thinking in and along my default track. So I constantly remind myself and force myself to not just go with my first or second thought.
Do you have a process around that? Like, do you do it by a process of questioning yourself, or is there structure to it in any way?
Um, so the short version is yes, and it's become, I guess, probably a lot more intuitive. But the quickest way to explain it, there's two different methods that are really useful. One is just volume. So the number of ideas that you can come up with in a certain period of time, hopefully in the shortest period of time, good and bad. So training yourself to come up with a rapid number of ideas, and to willing to think of the ideas that are terrible along with the ideas that are good, and not judge them and just lay them all out. That can lead to thinking about things in a completely different way. So that's one. Um, I call that the 10 ideas in 10 minutes rule, where you set a timer and then you literally have to just crank them out. And it's fun to do with other people too. And then the other one, real quick, is it's a adapted Edward de Bono exercise, and Edward de Bono is the dude that thought of and came up
Lateral
with the
thinking.
concept of lateral thinking exactly. And again, the simplest way to force yourself to think in a way that you wouldn't normally think of is to insert a random word. And by collecting or having access to a random word, or just looking around the room and picking something at random, and then naming three attributes of that thing in the room, and then applying those attributes, forcing those attributes upon the problem that you're trying to solve or the thing you're trying to think about, is not a natural way to think, and it forces the brain into coming up with something new, something novel, which can be really fun.
I took an improv course years ago with this guy Misha Glauberman, who I heard on the radio the other day talking on CBC, and one of the exercises that he had us do, which I thought was hilarious, was two people would have an interaction, and you would give somebody a book, and the book was a medical dictionary, and as the receiver, you had to pretend that this was a gift that was being given to you by a dear friend, and you would open the medical dictionary, and whatever the word was on the top right page was the gift, and you then had to improvise being thankful. And when I got the book and I opened it up, it was syphilis, and I had to on the spot make up this appreciation, this overtly grateful thank you, and it was awesome. It was hilarious, and I even had to read some of the details. Let me look at this, look closer, and I'd read some of the details about syphilis and try to use that to ameliorate
Nice.
the response. But yeah, improvisation is a great way to spontaneously engage the imagination.
Before you answer, Leia, I just wanted to add that there's an awesome feature on Wikipedia, the random feature. So you can find a random topic, and it is really one thing that can be extraordinarily fun is to click on it twice, and those are the two things you have to relate to each other somehow and write a quick post about.
That ties in really well with what I was thinking. So I came across this concept that Yo-Yo Ma calls the edge effect, which is that creativity happens at the edge of two different ecosystems. And so when you
Right.
bring two things together, that sort of overlap creates new thinking, new ideas, new ways to combine things that you didn't think necessarily belong together. And so I know I need to pull up the research in terms of how this translates into academia, but papers that are written with contributing authors from two different fields tend to be cited more. There's examples of that, but it's really interesting how you can bring together two disparate ideas and find something that somebody else hadn't thought of before, just because you're using two things that already exist in a new way.
Yeah. That is one of the definitions of creativity is that finding some recombining things in a way that's novel and useful, and because otherwise it's just random, or it's just sort of gobbledygook, right? You can just make up a funny word, and then it doesn't necessarily have any relation to anything else and can't be used unless you're Dr. Seuss, in which case, damn. I don't know if you guys saw the guy rapping Dr. Seuss over the last 2 weeks. It's so good. He takes Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg beats and he raps Dr. Seuss books, and he reads the entire thing. He reads like Fox and Socks and The Cat in the Hat, and they're so good. They're so good. But that's sort of like taking a kid's book and Dr. Seuss's wonderful imagination and use of words, and then putting that together with these beats is just, it's so heaven. And you'd think that would be the most obvious thing in the world that should
Mm-hmm.
have been done 50 years ago.
Yeah.
before
Is
rap, but
is
whatever.
Dr. Zeus the Greek god that went to the university to get his PhD?
Yeah, Seuss.
Oh,
I say I.
sorry.
We said it differently when in the prairies. Doctor Zeus, just like we had Richard Scary books, not Richard Scary. Um, I don't know. We pronounce things funny.
I have two fun Wikipedia things to offer. One is there is a Wikipedia page that is called Unusual Articles, and Unusual Articles is just that. It's just the most unusual things. It's compiled as a humorous. A humorous collection of unusual articles, so that's always fun to look at. But there's another really fun game that I played on my phone, and I don't know if it still exists. But a few years ago, there was a game called 6 Degrees of Wikipedia. I think it ended up being called Wiki Hunt at one point,
Okay.
and the idea was that it would show you two Wikipedia articles, and the challenge was you had to get from the first article to the second article in 6 clicks within Wikipedia.
Cool. That's fun.
Yeah, it's super fun.
I like that. That could be a good game to play.
Yeah,
I feel
yeah.
like that should be a good sort of board game to find the connections between things, because that's the sort of thing that can help like stir creativity a little bit better, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the work that I do, I always use the term ABCD, which is always be connecting the dots. And I talk about, this is where you create, this is where creative ideas come from. And I used to do this years and years ago when smartphones were initially introduced with all the various, compasses and accelerometers and cameras and so on and so forth. Now, put a big list of these things on a whiteboard, and I would at random pick two or three and then force a connection between those dots and say, what would happen if you took the weather and maps and GPS, or weather and GPS and something else? What would happen if, what service could you do this? And I called it service layering. So you would just take the different services and layer them and create new functionality. And that was always really, really, really great. And then I've since evolved that to another ABCD, which is always be creating the dots, which is the more imaginative aspect of, you don't need the dots to exist for you to connect them. You can just create random dots on your own and then force connections between those created dots to
Yeah.
imagine
Totally.
new ideas and universes and so on and so forth.
So it's interesting that as we get older, we apply forced connections, but when you're a kid and you don't know a whole bunch of things, that those connections just happen to you. You don't go forcing them. You kind of just stumble upon these strange things, combinations of things that you've never seen before, like cheese and macaroni, right? For the first time, it's like, this is the best thing in the universe, but you've never thought that those two things could be combined until you see it, and then that sort of starts your mind thinking. Just like I mean, a lot of things become tropes, like fantasy and science fiction, and I think that it's really hard often for authors to come up with new ideas because they're basing a lot of things on the people that came before them, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they're genre for a reason because they have certain themes or they have certain kinds of events or creatures like dragons or spaceships or whatever. Um, I don't know where I'm going, but
Well,
I guess I just the thought of forcing connections when you're older and experiencing connections when you're younger, I guess was my thought.
I think that as an adult, you have a bunch of established connections. As a child, everything is a brand new connection, right? When the younger you
Yeah.
are, every single thing, it's like, oh, this object has a name. This action has a meaning. Like these are everything's brand new. So your imagination is always wondering, like, I wonder if this has a thing, and so on. And that's why I think kids and children test the limits of things. As we get older, we bucket things that repeat a lot into tropes, into cliches, and I had a friend who, when I worked in advertising, was working on a campaign for milk company, milk farmers in general, and he just used the old cliche like "don't cry over spilt milk" in an ad, and he was being criticized for having, this is so cliche, and his response was really simple. It was, these are 14-year-olds who have never heard this before. Like, it's not cliche to them.
Right.
And what we have to realize is that the things that we attribute to being repetitive and monotonous and trope like might not be like that for every single person. So I'm all about, dip your toe into the cliche bucket, use the puns, do the things that other people might think are tried and true or tired, because they might not be for a lot of people out there.
So you need some comfort with the novelty. You can't just have pure novelty, or it feels very out of context. If you were just only to say new and original words, you'd be speaking in tongues.
Mm-hmm.
If you were writing or making something for other people to read or consume, they would feel alienated by it, right? So you do have to find the right combination. The imagination needs to also be accessible and have things in it that are repeated, and then maybe repeated and repeated, but brought to you in a slightly tweaked way that allows you to recognize it, but also be stimulated at the same time.
Yeah.
So for me, I have a term that describes that, or a phrasing that describes that, and that is going from sense making to strange making. And that is this idea of something makes sense and it is, familiar. You know it, you've seen it before, and then within the context of that, you embed something weird or strange into it. And it's something.
Right.
It's a bit of an approach that I use when I do speculative design or experiential futures work, which is essentially creating like situations and stuff from the future, and having people interact with those things or immerse themselves in it. And it helps to have that aspect of, here's something familiar, so I can let my guard down a little bit, I can engage with it in a way that I sort of understand and know it. And then when it becomes increasingly weird or you discover something strange about it, then it kind of provokes you into thinking a little bit. So it's a tactic to sort of bring you in and then shift how you're thinking.
I feel like there's probably a formula that you could extract by uh, analyzing the most popular kinds of fiction or the most popular types of fiction, to be able to get an idea of how much of it is new and how much of it is is nostalgia and or comfort. That would be interesting.
It plays into the idea of the archetypes, right? Like, so narratives have
Yeah.
archetypes and they have structures and they have templates for how we go about writing them. So the archetype of a tragedy can be different than the archetype of a comedy, but both have a familiar pattern to them. And then we take that sort of archetype and that familiar pattern and we stick new things in them. And I mean,
Right.
if we go back to thinking about, how we sort of apply this in work context, like in systems thinking, you have archetypes. And so when you encounter a problem, that problem has a certain pattern to it, and these same patterns tend to play out in organizations or in systems again and again and again. And so we can take that same pattern and acknowledge, like, okay, here's the pattern. What's the actual condition that's playing out? What's the story of that pattern? And we can analyze and create solutions and interventions that way too.
Yeah, it's funny. Like that reminds me a lot of the hero's journey or the story circle, where you have a certain archetype that plays out in a specific order, where they get called on a quest, and then they have to enter an unfamiliar territory and fight and experience some things and get better at something and take something on and learn something about themselves and then come back changed. And I mean, that's the Joseph Campbell's, what's that called, the myth, monomyth. But it's funny, if you break that pattern too much, the story just isn't as satisfying, even if it's really ridiculously original, and there's always this dance that you have to play with keeping it relatable and keeping it imaginative and and creative.
Okay, there are a lot of people who struggle with imagination out there, right? I remember asking somebody once, we were just having a conversation, and I thought I would spice it up, and I just asked them, what do you think about the future? What do you think things are going to look like for 5, 10, or 15 years from now? And I was shocked at the response, and the reaction was, just this complete uh, indifference, or like I don't know, I don't know, like kind of like today, like there was no conceiving, there was no thought, there was no, and I couldn't attribute it to whether they were afraid to think about the future or whether or not they genuinely had not really thought about that. But I think there are people out there who struggle with imagination, and I see it with Skillshare courses on creativity and so on and so forth. Those are some of the highest ranked courses out there. People want to use their imagination, engage their creativity more often. They want to be able to think about things. And Jason, you talked about, there are times where you're forcing creativity, and Leia, you talked about, processes like sense making to strange making, and intentionally putting that strange object in there. And I've got other ideas of, like, I had a what if situation where you could take anything and you could ask questions like, what if it was big, what if it was small, what if it could speak, so on and so forth. I had about 100 of these things on a list that you could just randomly point at. When I think of creative process, I do really imagine that it is a process. Like, there are tools that we use to force ourselves to be creative, and I think a lot of people would like to hear ideas on how might they use a tool like that to force themselves to be creative, because it's not about landing to a great idea, it's just about landing to an idea. As Jason said earlier, an idea a minute is entirely doable, knowing that 8 of those 10 ideas might be pure shit, but that's the process. You have
Yeah.
to come up with a
Yeah.
bunch of shitty ideas to do that. If you have any maybe specific or concrete techniques that people could use to really engage their imagination, that'd be a really great thing to leave, I think.
I think if before we jump to that, I just want to comment on something that you said at the beginning of that,
That
thought.
long ramble.
I was trying not to use the word
It's
ramble.
okay, you can do that.
Being diplomatic. So it struck me, this idea that, people struggle with imagination. So I had two thoughts around that. One is, does everybody need to be imaginative? Is that really like something that we have to require of everybody? Or is it okay that, some people don't want to think about the future and stretch their thinking in a way that you and I might be inclined to do? The other thing being that I've heard a lot of futurists say that we have a crisis of imagination. I'm not sure I agree with that statement, but this idea that it is really hard for people to think of alternatives, in a way that isn't stuck in the present and stuck in things that we already know, to really have real novelty. So, what do you guys think of that? And then I think jumping to the tools would be great.
Just to clarify, crisis of imagination, what, like, there isn't enough imagination going on? Is that what that means? Or there's too much imagination going on?
Not enough.
There's not enough imagination going on.
Yeah, that's typically how it's described.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly think it's always been that way. I think that there's always the people that, like Dre was talking about, who don't really think about the future that much, or don't really need to be imaginative, and it's kind of like the makers and takers aspect of it. I think it's just more, it's more prevalent now because everybody's trying to make it by creating content, and they want their content to stand out. But most people are just doing derivative things. They're making a TikTok video based on their favorite song, which is everyone else's favorite song, and everyone else is doing the same dance. and and they want to. It's almost like they're not saying I want to be more creative. They're saying I want people to notice me, and not really understanding that then they have to differentiate themselves, which means they have to somehow present themselves as something original that people are going to suddenly uh, discover or gravitate
Mhm.
toward because they've already seen everything else. It's like what was the Andy Warhol quote that everyone will be famous for 15 minutes? It's like now it's probably more like 5 seconds or the
Yeah, I think the new term now is that everybody wants their 15 minutes of privacy. Just as far as
that's
the
good.
creation aspect, and you're right. There's a lot of there's a lot of derivative stuff that's going on out there. I watched an ad, not an ad today, a compilation of advertising um, around the coronavirus thing, and every brand is doing exactly the same thing, down to like it starts with a piano, and then here are the words that are used here, and this is what happens, and it's sad and and comical at the same time, but there are a lot of people who want to be creative, and they might not be they might not be able to come up with the idea, but they're able to put a spin on an idea, and I think that's what a lot of pop culture is about. That's why a lot of music sounds like the hit single, right? Not so much, well, likely chiefly due to the producers that want it to sound like that. But yeah,
It's
there's
just one Swedish guy
yeah,
apparently.
Max Martin.
So
Max Martin writes a gajillion of the top 10 hits that are out there. Yeah, there's like six of these songwriters that are the big ones. The uh, I think there's something to consider around creation and recreation. Creation will be the people who come up with the original ideas, and recreation will be the remix culture that is grown out of that. Remix, recreation, refurbished, whatever you want to call that. I think it's all
yeah,
good. And there is a
yeah.
Pareto principle. There is 20% of the people out there making the content, and 80% of the people consuming the content. And I think that principle exists the same way that there are always more cooks than there are people eating at the restaurant. But there's nothing wrong with people recreating stuff. So I would definitely like to acknowledge and recommend that if you are not creating something, then just go and recreate something, because that's just as good and just as important.
I I'd like to add to that I think that the act of copying someone is a creative act because trying your best to imitate someone else is still going to go through your own filters, and you're going to learn a lot of things by doing that copying. So copying and like you said, what did you call it? Recreation or
Recreation. Yeah.
recreation is actually
Recreation?
a really, yeah, recreation. It's a really good tool to get better at
Yeah.
something and to practice it, and to study the act of it. My definition of creativity is the act of connecting things in exceptional ways, and there's three parts to that, and the most important and the biggest part of it, the 80% of that, is the act. So if creativity is the act of connecting things in exceptional ways, you've got to be doing something, otherwise nothing is
Mm-hmm.
happening. And the second part of that is the connection, and the connections come from, like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, when you have different experts that come together in different fields, they're connecting ideas in ways that couldn't have been connected before. And then the last bit of that is the exception, and the exception to the rule, the outlier, the piece of interest in what people would call originality, that comes from you, and that comes from you expressing things through yourself, because everyone's an original person. So you have to practice things a lot. You have to get really good at something, if you want to. um, you have to study and understand or connect to a lot of different things, often disparate things, so that you can bring novel and interesting things, combinations together. And then you've got to get better at being able to express yourself and trust yourself, and be not be afraid to put yourself out there, not be afraid to fail, not be afraid to be vulnerable. and to just let and accept criticism, and all those three things combined can really really push your creative output for
Mm-hmm.
sure.
You've codified a lot of this in this creative process. Can you just give us a quick spiel on what it is that you've done, that I've seen you speak about?
Uh, sure. It's hard. Usually, I talk about it for about an hour straight. so,
Elevator pitch me,
so
man.
I will not do it. That I will not do that. I basically did it. I mean, first you define creativity, you understand the definition, and then you understand where your strengths and weaknesses are. Are you stronger in action, connection, or exception? And then those combinations create different creative types, and then those creative types, um, they're more it's more useful, or they're more predisposed to certain kinds of tools and certain types of exercises that allow you to focus on the action concept, or on the connection part of it, or the exception part of it. And it's essentially about understanding yourself. I often say it's not about how creative you are, it's about how you are creative. So when you go about being creative, understanding where you have some challenges allows you to study and practice certain and bring certain tools to the table that'll make you better at what you do and make you more creative. And I've got lists of them.
I do like that model. I will say though, like I think to the point on social media, I think we put a lot of pressure on everyone to have certain skills now. Like everybody needs to be creating, everybody needs to have a sense of imagination. And I don't know if that's true. So going back to this idea of, is there a crisis of imagination? I keep saying I don't think there is. I think there's a lot of smart people out there who have a lot of creative ideas who don't necessarily get those ideas heard. And I think more so than a crisis of imagination, we have a crisis of entrenched power. And so you have people who hold positions of power who, have been in those positions for a long time that want to maintain where they are. And so really smart, really creative ideas don't get to come to the forefront and don't get to be implemented because there's people who have a vested interest in keeping things is, as opposed to letting those new ideas come about. And I think about things like, with environmental and sustainability, like we're doing all sorts of innovation around that right now. And there's so many different ideas from like bacteria that can eat plastics and having different types of materials like hemp that could be used to produce new things. And a lot of those just don't get to live and breathe in the same way. In terms of the tools, going back to your question, Dre, around like, is there a certain tool or thing that you use? I got asked about my model a few times this week, the 7 foundations model that I created, and the question specifically around it was, how do you use that to sort of design new things and get at new ways of thinking? And my response was something that I actually picked up from Elon Musk, which was, you design from first principles. So when they were designing the Tesla battery, they thought about like, what is a battery? Like, what does a battery at a very fundamental level need to be? Not the parts that we make it out of now, not the things that we, do with it now, but going back to it, like, well, it's a source of power, right? And it can be made from a number of different things. And there's things that you can combine in different ways to get to that point. So I was advocating for, using the model that I had in a first principles way and saying, okay, if we need to look at something like science, science is at its very, very core, in a very basic way, the way we observe and experiment with natural things. So if that's a fundamental definition of science, then science sort of opens up. And if you're trying to imagine what a science could, or the field of science could be in the future, then that definition, taking it down to that level, can open up new ideas for how the field could work in the future.
Yeah, first principles is it's a kind of field of like logic study. And I remember hearing something along this idea that Elon Musk was, he needed batteries for his solar city or car or whatnot, and batteries cost this much money. It was a lot of money to buy a battery, and he just went down to the first principles: was what is a battery? Well, a battery is, lithium ion, um, and this and a cylinder, and each one of these things could be purchased at these individual prices. So he's able to quantify that as like, oh, it costs this much money to make a battery.
It reminded me of something when I was studying creativity and looking for all these different ways of being creative. There's there's something called TRIZ, TRIZ. It's a Russian methodology that comes from a guy who worked at a patent office, and he kept track of every type of change because he would see people iterate, right? Here's a new patent. Well, this is slightly different and this is slightly different. And he came up with a long laundry list of ways to change an object. And you can literally go through that list step by step. And I think there's 30 some things, maybe 40 some things. And ask yourself these questions and change that object and turn it into something completely new by the end. And obviously you have to test it and see if it's actually useful, but it's very first principles based. And you're looking at pieces and components and asking yourself, well, if I did something different to this, if this component was slightly different, how would it alter the end result? Sort of like Edison trying to come up with different filaments for the light bulb. He tested, I don't know how many things before he got to tungsten, and then he's like, shit, this works really well. But he went on to use a bunch of other elements after the most successful one, just to make sure there wasn't something even better after that. And so another method is having and using other people's methodologies, like going through lists, and it really helps your brain think, if I apply this methodology to what I'm doing, how does that change what I'm doing? And does it make it better? Or does it make me better? Or does it allow me to learn something that I wouldn't have learned otherwise? So all of these, I'm obsessed with methodologies. And Leia, I love your methodology so much about, I'm really intrigued by the 7
foundations.
What did you call them? The
seven foundations.
The 7 foundations, and especially the number 7. I'd love to have a conversation later about why it's 7 and if that's related to anything else. And Dre, I mean, we used to come up with advertising ideas together back in the noughts, and it's always fascinating to sit down and try to come up with something that makes sense, but that's not too smart. And I'd love to know, before we close, what methods do you use to you're a very award-winning creative director and done a lot of really successful ad campaigns. What method, or are you just great at this stuff naturally?
I think this is a combination of both. I think that I am predisposed to being highly imaginative and coming up with ideas, and I like you, entered advertising without really having an advertising background or even wanting to go into advertising, and we both had very successful careers that way. But I believe in some very basic things and stuff that you even brought up. So I'm a firm believer of accuracy through volume, which is come up with a lot of ideas quickly. And whenever I would come up with ideas, it would just be about not criticizing myself, but just come up with as many as humanly possible and save the judging for later. Creative directing a writer, I would give them really not impossible, but daunting tasks. I would ask for 50 headlines or 100 headlines, right? Not just give me a few. No, show me it all. So another aspect is show me the work was the other thing I used to say a lot in the creative director world, is that as much as you give me a few really, really great ideas, I want you to show me the work. I want you to prove to me that you produced 100 ideas. I want to see a few pages of thoughts that went through. So I do believe that discipline in coming up with work is important, but a lot of it is when I was at Rethink, we used to talk about the 1 or 100 rule. And the idea was that, your best idea will be your first idea or your 100th idea. You just won't know until you've done the work. And
Yeah.
I'll tell you, a lot of times I would come up with 100 ideas and it was the first one that was still the best idea. That happens, but you just don't know until you actually exhaust yourself. And so those are some of the main things. A lot of it is work. It's not creativity is not a gift so much as it is a skill that you have to practice and then you have to work on. And your brain is an organ, but I like to think of it more as a muscle, and it is something that you can work out and develop over time.
Cool.
I like this
Yeah, this is
conversation.
a super fun one. All right, so before we close it off, Jason, can you let us know where we can find this creative methodology that you've created? Because it is pretty freaking cool.
I have, again, it's on a huge part of it is on a Notion page, which doesn't have a short URL, so it's also not complete because I never finish anything that I start, which is something that I'm working on in
This
perpetuity.
is the creative person's
But
dilemma.
I'll put it in the show notes. It's called right now it's called The Creative Journey.
Nice. Okay.
So you've got stuff up on Medium, and you've got a presentation you did at FITC last year, so we can link those.
Yeah.
out.
So we'll put that in the show notes.
That's true.
So we'll put that in the show notes. We're going to put Leia's recorded talk that she did this week, a redo of her last week's webinar, in the show notes as well, because that's also a very cool thing to look at. And I guess we'll call it a day. We'll call it a cast, if you will.
And then imagine what's next.
Well, you know what? I always like to say that the future belongs to those who imagine it. So go imagine some interesting futures. And from all of us at the Post Normal Show, we will see you in the future.